Hello students, welcome to biology class. In this period we are going to start new unit that is about energy transformation. In this unit we are going to see two subtopics. These two subtopics are respiration and photosynthesis. The first part of the unit is about respiration, and in this unit, in this part, we are going to see the structure of ATP, and its role in energy transformation. And also we are going to see how ATP is adapted to its role, in transferring energy within a cell. And next to this, we are going to see how ATP is produced in cell, because this ATP is very important molecule, energy carrier molecule. So we are going to see how ATP is produced in cell. And lastly, we are going to discuss the different stages of cellular respiration, So to begin with, we are going to see the structure of ATP, what ATP looks like. ATP stands for, it is an abbreviation that stands for adenosine triphosphate, and this molecule has three components. One of the components is adenine, which is base. The other component is 5-carbon sugar, ribose, and the third component is phosphate. You know that a molecule having these three components is known as nucleotide. Therefore, our ATP is type of nucleotide. But what makes ATP different from other type of nucleotide is ATP has more phosphate groups compared with other nucleotide molecules. All nucleotides have three components: nitrogenous base, pentose sugar, and phosphate group. But in case of ATP, ATP has more additional phosphates, and for this reason, ATP is known as a phosphorylated nucleotide. It is known as a phosphorylated nucleotide. A phosphorylated nucleotide means a nucleotide with extra phosphates, ATP, in addition to this, it is also known as energy currency of the cell. To make it clear, when we say energy currency of the cell, it is to mean that cells can use ATP as they need energy for different metabolic process. Immediately, they can use ATP. That's why it is known as energy currency. Let me give you one example. You may have many in your pocket or in bank. In time of need, or when you need to pay sort of money, you immediately pay money from your pocket rather than from bank. That's why ATP is known as energy currency. Cells immediately use ATP for metabolic process rather than using stored ATP, stored energy in the form of chemical compounds. For that reason, ATP is known as energy currency of the cell. So ATP provides us energy. This energy will be obtained when the phosphate group detach, or when the last phosphate break from the ATP molecule, it can release energy. Here it shows how ATP release energy for cells. As you see here, this one is the structure of ATP. Here we have the 5-carbon sugar and the adenine base, the nitrogenous base, and the phosphate groups are 3 in case of ATP, as we said earlier. And when energy is needed by cell, this third phosphate or this bond will break and release energy. This energy will be used by cells, and the molecule become adenosine diphosphate, which means having 2 phosphate on the molecule. This adenosine diphosphate is a molecule with a lesser energy compared with that of ATP. So what will happen? When cells store energy, a phosphate group will be added to adenosine diphosphate to form ATP. At this time, what will happen? Energy will be stored. Therefore, ATP can provide energy by breaking the last two bonds, when cells need energy, and this energy will be used by the cell, and again the molecule will be reformed by joining phosphate group to adenosine diphosphate. This is how ATP release energy for cells. So if ATP has such structural adaptation, how this structural form or how ATP is adapted for its role. What is its role? Its role is carrying energy for cellular activities. ATP is adapted to its role because it releases energy relatively in small amount. It releases energy relatively in small amount. This small amount is sufficient for the metabolic reaction. Secondly, ATP is adapted to its role because it releases energy in a single step hydrolysis. As you see here, a single step hydrolysis means with a single step breaking down of the ATP molecule, energy will be released. This is one of the adaptation, and it is available in cells at any time. Why? Because ATP cannot escape from the cytoplasm, which means ATP cannot leave cell, and it is always present in the cytoplasm. So cells can use ATP for their metabolic process. If ATP provides such important role for cells, what type of processes use ATP in living organisms? Here we have some of the examples. For example, synthesis of macromolecule. When we say macromolecule, it can be making large molecules like protein, making carbohydrates, lipids, and so on, even nucleotides. When polynucleotides formed by synthesis process, all these building up process need energy from ATP. And the other one is active transport, which we have deal on this part on our previous class, and muscle contraction and so on. These are processes that use ATP in living organisms. Students, we have seen some of the introduction part on ATP, and now it's time for our first activity. Our first activity has three questions, and I will give you 1 minute to answer these questions. Okay, welcome back, students. Our activity says which of the following is called energy currency of the cell. For this question, if you answer B, it is known as, it is ATP, which is the energy currency of the cell. So you have got the correct answer. For the second question, put the following energy carrying molecules from the highest level to the next smaller. It says AMP, ATP, and ADP. From the highest one is ATP, and From ATP, the next one is ADP, and the least one is AMP, which means adenosine triphosphate, adenosine diphosphate, and adenosine monophosphate. These are the energy carrying molecules by which cells use for metabolic process. Name 2 processes that require energy from ATP. You can list any of 2 examples that we have seen earlier. You can say active transport, you can say macromolecule formation, and so on. Okay, now let's move on to the next part. In this part, we are going to see how ATP is produced in cell. If ATP is such an important molecule, how cells produce ATP? It is simply by a process known as phosphorylation. ATP is produced by process known as phosphorylation. Phosphorylation means it is addition of phosphate to a molecule or to a substrate. So when is this phosphorylation occur in cell? Phosphorylation occurs in cell during cellular respiration that takes place in every type of living organism, and during photosynthesis, which is unique for producers. Therefore, ATP can be produced by phosphorylation in cells at the time of cellular respiration or at the time of photosynthesis. If ATP is produced by respiration and photosynthesis, let's have how ATP produced in respiration, which is our lesson in this topic. ATP is produced in respiration by 2 main pathways. These are aerobic pathway, that is pathway that use oxygen. Anaerobic pathway is pathway, or it is type of process that occurs in the absence of oxygen. How ATP is produced in aerobic respiration? If ATP produced both aerobically and anaerobically, how aerobic respiration produces ATP? Aerobic respiration produces ATP by 2 ways: substrate level phosphorylation and by oxidative phosphorylation, or by using an enzyme known as Atp synthase. Cellular respiration produces ATP by these 2 methods. If we look at substrate level phosphorylation, substrate level phosphorylation, as its name indicates, there is something with substrates. Therefore, in substrate level phosphorylation, phosphate will be added to ADP from intermediate products or from substrates. For that reason, it is known as substrate level phosphorylation. Therefore, when phosphate added to ADP from substrates, the process is known as substrate level phosphorylation, and by this process, cells produce only 10% of the ATP gained from aerobic respiration. Here, I'm not sure the diagram is visible for you, but for the sake of understanding, here we have adenosine diphosphate. This molecule is adenosine diphosphate, and this one is substrate with phosphate, and this substrate will transfer the phosphate to adenosine diphosphate to form what? To form ATP. This is an example for substrate level phosphorylation, in which the substrates will transfer phosphate to ADP to form ATP. The second process by which ATP is produced in aerobic respiration is by using Atp synthase. Atp synthase is an enzyme which is found in mitochondrial inner membrane or in chloroplast. It is protein in membranes of chloroplast and mitochondria, and Atp synthase is important in producing ATP in aerobic respiration, and by this method cells produce 90% of the total ATP produced by aerobic respiration. Atp synthase produce ATP by taking or by using hydrogen ions that are released from respiratory substrates. These respiratory substrates are organic molecules that can be respired, which means that can be break down to release energy. You can take example, glucose, protein, fats, and so on. These are respiratory substrates. And when these substrates respire, or when these substrates break down in respiratory pathway, they release hydrogen ion, and this will be used by ATP synthase to synthesize ATP. Here we have the diagram for ATP synthase. ATP synthase, as I have told you, is found in the inner mitochondrial membrane, and in the inner mitochondrial membrane, this ATP synthase molecule is found in the membrane as membrane protein. And what will happen? Hydrogen ions, as you see here, accumulate in the intermembrane space, and when these protons pass along the ATP synthase, what will happen? This part of the molecule, the lower part of the molecule, start to rotate. This rotation will provide energy to bind phosphate with ADP to form ATP. Phosphate with ADP to form ATP. And this inorganic phosphate will bind with adenosine diphosphate to form ATP by using the energy that is generated by the ATP synthase. This is the second step, the second process by which cells produce ATP in aerobic respiration. If ATP produced by this mechanism, from where does the hydrogen come from? The hydrogens come from respiratory substrates when they break down in the process, and these hydrogens can be taken by two important molecules. These are nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide, or in short NAD, and flavin adenine dinucleotide, or FAD. These two molecules are very important in carrying hydrogen from respiratory substrate and transferring the hydrogen to ATP synthase. This is because, students, cellular respiration or aerobic respiration is type of a redox reaction. You know this term in your chemistry. Redox reaction is type of reaction in which one part of the reaction undergo oxidation, and at the same time the other part undergo reduction. In our case, our respiratory substrate is glucose. Glucose combined with oxygen to produce carbon dioxide, water, and some ATP. In this reaction, the reaction is a redox reaction. A redox reaction, this is because glucose oxidized and oxygen become reduced. In this process, the hydrogen that are released from respiratory substrate or glucose can be taken by these two coenzymes, and this hydrogen will be transferred to ATP. Transferred to ATP synthase. We call these molecules coenzymes. You know coenzymes in your unit 3 when you deal on enzymes, and they do not act as enzyme, but they can support enzymes in cellular respiration. These two coenzymes are NAD and FAD, as we've seen. So if ATP synthesized by this mechanism, let's have the second activity of this lesson, which says substrate level phosphorylation yields most of the ATP produced during aerobic respiration. The question is a true-false type question, and I will give you 20 seconds to answer these two questions. Okay, students, welcome back. For the first question, substrate level phosphorylation yields most of the ATP produced during aerobic respiration. If you answer false, you are right, because most of the ATP is produced by oxidative phosphorylation or by ATP synthase. The second question says coenzymes are used to carry hydrogen in redox reaction of respiration. This is true. So if you say true, you got correct answer. Okay, that is great, students. Now let's move on to the next part, that is stage of aerobic respiration. Up to now, we have seen how ATP is synthesized, how cells use ATP, and how ATP is produced in aerobic respiration. Now we are on time to see the stages of aerobic respiration. Aerobic respiration, as you know, is respiration that use oxygen to break down glucose to release energy in the form of ATP. And this process has 4 stages: glycolysis, the link reaction, and Krebs cycle, and the last one, electron transport and chemiosmosis. Glycolysis is the first stage of cellular respiration, and from its name, it indicates that glyco stands for sugar, and this one is breaking. Therefore, in glycolysis, what will happen? Sugar, or glucose in our case, will break down, or it will split into 2 molecules of a 3-carbon compound or a 3-carbon sugar. That's why the process is said to be glycolysis. This process takes place in the cell cytoplasm. It takes place in cells cytoplasm. The second stage is link reaction. Link reaction, as its name indicates, it links glycolysis with that of Krebs cycle. It links glycolysis with Krebs cycle because it is a single-step reaction. In link reaction, what will happen? Pyruvate will be converted into acetyl-CoA with a single-step process, and this reaction takes place in the matrix of the mitochondria. When we come to the third step, it is Krebs cycle. Krebs cycle also occurs in the matrix of mitochondria. And in Krebs cycle, most of the chemical energy stored in glucose will be changed into NADH and FADH, which means most of the energy stored in the form of NADH and FADH. The last one is electron transport and chemiosmosis. Electron transport and chemiosmosis occurs on the cristae of mitochondria. On the cristae, you know, it is the inner mitochondrial membrane, and this process occurs on the surface of cristae. And in this process, what will happen? The chemical energy stored in the form of reduced NAD and reduced fat will be completely changed into ATP, and most of the ATP will be produced at the 4th stage of cellular respiration. So, if cellular respiration has 4 stages, where does these 4 stages takes place? As I have told you, glycolysis takes place in the cytoplasm of the cell, and the remaining process, link reaction, Krebs cycle, and electron transport system takes place in the mitochondria. They occur in separate part of the cell. And here we have the diagram that shows where does this different stages of cellular respiration occurs. Here we have glycolysis, and as I have told you, in glycolysis what will happen? Glucose will be changed into pyruvic acid. This reaction occurs in the cytosol or in the cytoplasm of the cell. And the next step, link reaction and Krebs cycle, occurs in the mitochondrial matrix. And the last step occurs on the inner mitochondrial membrane. It occurs on the inner mitochondrial membrane. This shows the different stages of aerobic respiration takes place at different part of the mitochondria as well as the cytoplasm. So if cellular respiration uses this different part of the cell, it will provide the cell with more energy compared with other type of respiration, that is anaerobic respiration. Here we have the summary where does the cellular respiration occurs and what product or what processes takes place at each step. In glycolysis, as we said, the process occurs in the cytoplasm, and what will happen in glycolysis? Glucose will break into pyruvate. Link reaction is the second process that takes place in the matrix of mitochondria, and pyruvate will break into acetyl-CoA. Krebs cycle occurs in the matrix, and acetyl-CoA break into carbon dioxide, and more of the energy stored in the form of chemical energy. Electron transport chain occurs on cristae, and at this point reduced NAD and reduced fat lose their hydrogen to form ATP. If you remember, when we talk about these two coenzymes, we have said that cellular respiration is type of redox reaction. In this type of redox reaction, when some substrates oxidized, some other substrates become reduced. And these two coenzymes, when they gain hydrogen, they become reduced. When they lose hydrogen, they become oxidized. So at the time of electron transport chain, they will lose their hydrogen, which means they become oxidized, and this hydrogen will be used by the cell to produce ATP. The other point is, since we are talking about aerobic respiration, up to now we have no idea where does oxygen involved in the reaction. Here it indicates that glycolysis, from the 4 stages of cellular respiration, it can occur in the absence of oxygen, or it can occur without involvement of oxygen. But what about the other stages? The other stages are all depend on the presence of oxygen. These stages are link reaction, Krebs cycle, and electron transport system. We will see this one later on, why oxygen is very important for the rest of the reaction. Okay, students, up to now we have seen how ATP is synthesized and how cellular respiration is used in cell to produce ATP. And the first point that we have discussed is ATP, which is a nucleotide with sugar, and this sugar is what? The pentose sugar. And in our case, in case of ATP, the pentose sugar is ribose sugar. Okay? And as nucleotide, ATP contain base, nitrogenous bases. The base is adenine or adenosine. And the third component is phosphate. The third component is phosphates. In our case, the phosphates are found 3 in number. And this molecule is important energy carrier molecule, so it is known as energy currency of the cell. Energy currency of the cell, we call ATP as energy currency of the cell. This is because cells can easily use ATP as source of energy, or ATP can provide energy for cells. And when ATP provide energy for cells, this is because of 3 reasons, as we said. One of the reason, it can easily hydrolyze. The other one is it can provide sufficient energy or small amount of energy equivalent to the cell requirement, and it is always present in cell. It is always present in cell. And the other one is, if ATP is such an important molecule, how it is formed. ATP is formed. It is formed by what? By a process known as phosphorylation. By a process known as phosphorylation. Phosphorylation is simply, it is addition of phosphate. Addition of phosphate to a substrate. Phosphorylation occurs in cell by different way. It can be in cellular respiration, or it can be during photosynthesis. Okay? In cellular respiration, as we've seen, phosphorylation or formation of ATP can be by aerobic. In cellular respiration, ATP can be produced by aerobic pathway or anaerobic pathway. In aerobic pathway, ATP can be produced by substrate level phosphorylation or by oxidative phosphorylation. Okay? And substrate level and oxidative phosphorylation produce ATP by using hydrogen that is released from substrates. And these two processes can occur because of cellular respiration. In cellular respiration, which has 4 stages that we've seen: glycolysis, link reaction, Krebs cycle, and electron transport chain and chemiosmosis. These 4 stages occur at different parts of the cell, in the cytoplasm, in the matrix of mitochondria, and on the mitochondrial inner membrane, on the cristae. All these processes are important to produce ATP from glucose molecule. This is what we have seen in this period. If you have any question, you can ask. For the next period, students, I need your textbook and be ready with your textbook. Thank you for listening.